The wind bit through Margaret's thin shawl, a constant, hungry thing. It was the same wind that had howled the day they buried her husband, the day the mining company took their home, the day she'd started counting pennies instead of blessings. Now her arms ached from the weight of her daughter, Lily, who was limp as a rag doll. 5 days without food, 5 days where the silence had grown louder than the crying. The silence was the sound of her little girl slipping away. She stopped outside Whitmore's general store, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Inside was a different world, a world of warmth, of light, of food. A little boy laughed, his face sticky with a peppermint stick. Maggie's hands tightened on Lily. She opened her palm. 7 cents. That was it. The last of everything. Her wedding ring was gone. Her winter coat was gone. 7 cents to buy back her daughter's life. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The warmth was so sudden, so thick she almost fell. Every head turned. Every eye judged. The whispers started instantly, sharp and cruel as the winter wind. Look at her. Can't feed her own child. A disgrace. Her cheeks burned, but she pulled her shoulders back, holding Lily tighter. Behind the counter, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore looked up from her ledger, her face a mask of disapproval. "We don't give charity here," she said, her voice flat and hard. Maggie's words came out as a broken whisper. "Please, ma'am. My little girl, she's so sick. I have 7 cents. Just a little bread." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed into slits. "Hard work is what this town is built on, not handouts. If you were willing to work, you'd find it." "I've tried on," Maggie choked out, the shame like a stone in her throat. "The laundry turned me away. The boarding house. They won't hire a woman with a child." "Enough," Mrs. Whitmore snapped. "I won't encourage laziness." A man in a fur-lined coat muttered to his wife, "Pitiful." Maggie's knees buckled. Lily's head lolled back, her breathing shallow, a tiny puff of air in the warm, hostile room. Her daughter was dying right there, in front of them all. Then another voice cut through the whispers, deep and official. "Mrs. O'Connor." Sheriff Clay Turner stepped forward. His face wasn't cruel, just certain. He was a man who believed in rules, and she had broken the most important one. She had failed. "We spoke last week," he said slowly, his eyes flicking to Lily's pale face. "A child needs proper care. If you can't provide it—" He let the words hang in the air, but Maggie knew what they meant. The poorhouse, a place children went in but rarely came out. "No," she whispered, desperation clawing at her. "Please, she's all I have." The sheriff's face was grim. "The poorhouse is better than death." The store fell silent. This was it. The end. She had failed. Her baby was going to be taken, or she was going to die. There were no other choices. The weight of it all was crushing her. And then the bell over the door rang again. A shadow fell over the room, so vast it seemed to drink the light. A man stood in the doorway, a giant of a man, with shoulders wide enough to block out the sun. He stepped inside, and the very air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy and still. Samuel Hawthorne. He was a rancher from the High Valley, a man spoken of in whispers, a man who kept to himself. His weathered hands looked like they were carved from rock. Every single person in that store, even the sheriff, straightened up. "Hawthorne," the sheriff said, a note of respect in his voice. Sam nodded once, his storm-gray eyes sweeping the room, taking in the scene in a single, silent glance. He saw the wealthy townsfolk, their baskets full. He saw Mrs. Whitmore behind her counter, her face pinched and righteous. He saw the sheriff, standing over a broken woman, and then his eyes landed on Maggie and Lily. His gaze locked onto the small, limp form in her arms. The hard lines of his face seemed to crack. His jaw tightened, as if he were trying to swallow a stone. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The giant rancher just stood there, staring. Then he took a step closer, and another. He looked down at Lily's hollow cheeks, her parted lips, her fragile, still body. And then something impossible happened. A tear slid down the weathered face of Samuel Hawthorne. It traced a path through the dust and grit on his cheek, a single silent drop of water in a desert of cruelty. The townsfolk stared, their mouths agape. This man, this mountain of a man, was weeping. Mrs. Whitmore sniffed, her voice dripping with scorn. Don't you go wasting your pity on her, Mr. Hawthorne. Some people make their own misery. Sam's massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't look at her. His eyes never left Lily. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it rolled through the store like thunder. How much, he asked, for everything the child needs? Mrs. Whitmore blinked, confused. What? Milk, bread, medicine, blankets, he said, his voice raw. How much? The store owner stammered, caught completely off guard. Well, that would be... But Sam wasn't listening. Another tear fell. He was looking at Lily as if he saw a ghost. Maggie couldn't look away. In his eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw recognition. This stranger, this giant, knew her pain. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Now, Sam, you don't want to encourage dependency. Sam's head snapped toward the sheriff, and his glare was so sharp, so fierce, it cut the man's words right out of his throat. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and slapped a wad of bills onto the counter. The sound echoed in the silent room. Everything, he growled. Don't cheat her, Agnes, or you'll answer to me. Mrs. Whitmore's face went pale. She scrambled to fill a basket, her hands shaking as she piled in bread, a bottle of milk, jars of medicine, thick woolen blankets. The town watched, stunned into silence. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She was torn between a desperate, soaring gratitude and a cold, familiar fear. She had learned the hard way that men never gave without expecting something in return. What price would this giant demand? Sam's deep voice rumbled again, softer this time, directed at her. Come, your daughter needs to eat. Maggie looked from the basket of life-saving food to the stranger's tear-streaked face. Her choices had vanished. There was only one path left. Trust him, or watch her daughter fade away in her arms. Outside, the wind howled, but Sam lifted the heavy basket like it was nothing. He walked to a waiting wagon, and Maggie followed on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. He helped her onto the seat, his touch surprisingly gentle. As she settled in, Lily stirred. Her eyes, which had been closed for days, fluttered open. Just for a second. But it was enough. The reins creaked. The wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the hateful town and into the vast, lonely wilderness. And Maggie O'Connor knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that her life had just been shattered and remade in the space of a single heartbeat. She was no longer in control. She was in the hands of the grieving giant. The wagon wheels crunched over the frozen ruts, carrying them farther and farther away from town. The silence in the wagon was as vast as the Montana sky above them. Sam Hawthorne didn't speak. He just drove, his massive hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Every so often, his gaze would flick to Maggie and the small bundle in her arms, a flicker of something unreadable in his storm-gray eyes. Lily whimpered, a tiny, fretful sound. Maggie's hands shook as she uncorked the bottle of milk. She brought it to her daughter's lips, her heart pounding. For a terrible second, Lily didn't respond. Then her mouth closed around the nipple and she began to drink. Slow, weak pulls. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was life. Tears streamed down Maggie's face. That's it, my love, she whispered. Drink. Sam's voice was a low rumble beside her. Not too much at once. Her stomach won't take it. Just a little at a time. Maggie glanced at him, surprised by the knowing gentleness in his tone. You speak as if you know. He didn't look at her, but his knuckles were white on the reins. I had a daughter once, he said, the words heavy and cold in the air. About her age. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard the whispers, the Hawthorne tragedy, but no one spoke of it directly. 2 years ago, he continued, his voice strained, a fire. It took my wife, Mary, and my little girl, Lucy. I tried to get to them. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. I wasn't fast enough. The only sound was the wind and the soft, steady suckling of Lily at the bottle. Maggie's own loss felt small and sharp next to the gaping wound of his. Her husband crushed in a cave-in. Her home taken. But he had lost his entire world in a single night of smoke and flames. "My husband," she finally whispered. "The mine company. They turned us out the day after the funeral." Sam nodded slowly, as if piecing together a story he already knew. "I know." The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a blow. Maggie stared at him. "What do you mean, you know?" His eyes were still on the road. "The Blackwood Mine. That was your husband's company." "Yes," she said, confused. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. What did he know about the mine? He didn't answer right away. The wagon crested a ridge, and a wide valley opened up below them. A sprawling ranch house nestled in the center, smoke curling from its chimney. "That's my place," he said, his voice quiet. As they drew closer, Maggie saw it wasn't just a house. It was a shrine. A child's swing dangled from a massive oak tree, its seat empty, swaying in the wind. A painted rocking horse sat on the porch, its colors faded and peeling. This wasn't just a home. It was a tomb, filled with the ghosts of a happy family. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch strong and sure. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old memories. A table was set for three, a thin layer of dust covering the plates. Children's drawings were tacked to the wall. Over the fireplace hung a portrait. Sam, a smiling woman with kind eyes and a little girl with a bright red ribbon in her hair. "Mary and Lucy," he said, his voice thick with a grief so raw it was suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to put their things away." He led her upstairs to a guest room, and she laid Lily on the bed. The little girl sighed, her body finally relaxing in the warmth. "Mama," she murmured, "it's warm." Tears pricked Maggie's eyes again. She turned and Sam was standing in the doorway, his huge frame filling the space. "You're safe here," he said, and for the first time in so long, she almost believed it. But as the wind howled outside, his earlier words echoed in her mind. "I know." What did he know? And why did this grieving stranger suddenly seem so much more dangerous than the starving she had left behind? She had traded a cage of poverty for a cage of secrets, and she had no idea what kind of man held the key. That night, after Lily had eaten a few spoonfuls of broth and fallen into the first deep sleep she'd had in weeks, Maggie found Sam by the fire. He was holding a small block of wood and a knife, and shavings were piling up at his feet. He was carving something. Slowly, under his calloused, powerful hands, the shape of a doll began to emerge. "For Lily," he said without looking up. "Every little girl should have a doll." The gesture was so tender it hurt. He had probably carved dozens of toys for his own daughter. Now he carved for hers. The kindness was a suffocating blanket. She had to know. "In the wagon," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "You said you knew about the mine. Blackwood Mine. How?" He stopped carving. He placed the knife and the half-finished doll carefully on the hearth. He finally looked at her, and the grief in his eyes was mingled with something else, something darker. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and heavy, "the Blackwood Mining Company, I owned it." The air left Maggie's lungs in a rush. The room tilted. The fire in the hearth seemed to shrink, the shadows in the corners growing into monsters. Her husband, the cave-in, the men who had come to their door, their faces grim, telling her he was gone. The company that had thrown her out onto the street. It was his company, his mine, his fault. "You," she stammered, scrambling to her feet, backing away from him. "My husband is dead because of you." "No," he said, standing up, his sighs suddenly menacing. "It was an accident, a terrible accident." "An accident?" she cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "They said it was a support beam. They said the company cut corners to save money. Men died for your profits." He took a step toward her, his hands raised as if in surrender. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Maggie. I was a silent partner. My father-in-law ran the operations. By the time I found out how bad things were, it was too late." Rage, pure and hot, surged through her. "Too late for my husband. Too late for the other men who died in that hole. But not too late for you to play the saint, sweeping into town to save the poor widow of the man you got killed." He flinched as if she had struck him. "That's not why I did it." Then why? She screamed, tears of fury streaming down her face. Why us? Because when I saw you in that store, he said, his voice cracking, when I saw your little girl, it was like seeing my Lucy all over again, fading away. I couldn't save my own family, Maggie. God forgive me, I thought maybe I could save yours. It was a confession, an admission of guilt cloaked in charity. He wasn't helping her out of kindness. He was helping her to quiet the ghosts that haunted him. She was his penance. Lily was his redemption. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison built of his guilt and her grief. And just as that terrible realization settled over her, a new sound cut through the night. It started as a low rumble, then grew louder. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast. Sam's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Maggie's heart seized in her chest. Outside, bobbing in the blackness, were the flickering orange eyes of torches. A lot of them. They were coming up the valley road, a river of fire and anger. "Who is it?" she whispered, clutching a hand to her throat. Sam turned from the window, and his face was a mask of grim resolve. He grabbed a heavy rifle from its rack above the fireplace. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice like iron. "Don't let them see you." "Who?" she demanded again, her voice shaking. He looked at her, and the look in his eyes chilled her to the bone. "The town," he said. "They've come for you." The torchlight washed over the porch, painting the front of the house in flickering, hellish strokes. The shouts of the mob grew louder, a chorus of angry, righteous voices. Sam stood just inside the door, rifle held loosely at his side. He was calm, too calm. "Evening, Sheriff," he said as Clay Turner swung down from his horse. Mrs. Whitmore was right behind him, her face twisted with smug victory. "Hawthorne," the sheriff said, avoiding his eyes. "There's talk, ugly talk. You can't just take a woman and her child out of town like this. It ain't proper." "Proper?" Sam's voice was a low growl. "You were about to send that child to the poorhouse. You call that proper?" "It's a scandal," Mrs. Whitmore shrieked, pointing a bony finger at the house. "An unmarried woman living in your home. What kind of example is that?" "The kind that saves a life," Sam shot back. "Something none of you were interested in doing." The accusation hit its mark. The crowd murmured, some of them shifting uncomfortably. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't done. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with a strange personal hatred. "Don't you lecture us, Samuel Hawthorne. We all know about you. We all know what really happened to your family." A tense silence fell over the yard. Sam's body went rigid. "They say," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice dripping venom, "that the fire wasn't an accident. They say you and your wife were fighting, that you were a mean husband, a careless father. They say if you'd been the man you pretend to be, they'd still be alive." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Maggie, watching from the shadows of the doorway, saw Sam physically stagger, as if he'd been shot. The rifle in his hand trembled. The pain on his face was so profound, so absolute. It was like looking into an open grave. And in that moment, something inside Maggie snapped. Her own grief, her own rage at him, was forgotten. This was different. This was a lie designed to destroy a man who was already broken. Before she could think, she flung the door open and stepped out onto the porch, Lily clinging to her skirts. "How dare you!" she cried, her voice ringing out in the cold night air. The crowd gasped, seeing her for the first time. "You stand there and accuse him, you who left my daughter to starve in the street. This man you slander, he showed more Christian kindness in one moment than your entire town has shown in a year. He saved my child's life. He is not the one who should be ashamed." The crowd was silent, stunned by her ferocity. Sheriff Turner looked down at his boots, but Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "You!" she screeched, turning her hatred on Maggie. "You have no place here. You are nothing but a tramp, ruining his good name." Sam straightened up. He moved to stand beside Maggie, placing a protective arm around her. The pain on his face was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that was more intimidating than any rage. His deep voice boomed across the yard, clear and unshakable. "Margaret O'Connor is not my shame," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "And she is not my charity." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over every face in the mob. "She will be my wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The sheriff's head jerked up, his eyes wide with shock. Maggie's heart stopped. She stared up at Sam, her mind reeling. Wife? What was he saying? Was he mad? "You want propriety?" Sam's voice cut through their shock like a knife. "You want what's decent? Then you will have it. There will be a wedding. And until that day, Mrs. O'Connor and her daughter remain under my protection. Now get off my land." No one moved. They were too stunned. He had called their bluff and raised the stakes so high they couldn't even see the top. Marriage. It was a shield, a weapon, a final, unanswerable defense against their judgment. But it was also a lie, wasn't it? A desperate, crazy lie spoken in the heat of the moment. The sheriff finally found his voice. "Hawthorne, you better think long and hard about what you just said. You can't take back words like that." Sam's eyes, cold as a winter storm, never wavered. "I don't intend to." The sheriff nodded, defeated. He signaled to the crowd and slowly, reluctantly, they began to disperse, their torches retreating back down the valley like a wounded beast. Mrs. Whitmore gave one last, hateful glare before being pulled away. The yard fell silent. Maggie stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Sam turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dying torchlight. The proposal, if you could call it that, still hung in the air between them, a terrifying, impossible promise. He had saved them from the mob, but he had just trapped them in a far more complicated cage. Back inside, the warmth of the house felt suffocating. Maggie put Lily to bed, her hands trembling as she smoothed the blankets. The little wooden doll Sam had carved sat on the nightstand, a silent testament to the tangled mess their lives had become. She went back downstairs. Sam was standing by the cold fireplace, staring into the embers. "You didn't mean it," she said, her voice small. It wasn't a question. He turned to face her. "Every word." "Why?" she whispered, her heart hammering. "Why would you do that? Tie yourself to me, to the widow of a man your company killed?" "Because it's the only way to keep you safe," he said, his voice raw. "To keep her safe. The town won't stop. They'll find a way to take Lily from you. The law, the church, they'll call you an unfit mother. But they won't dare touch the wife of Samuel Hawthorne. My name, my land. It's the only weapon we have." She sank into a chair, her head spinning. A marriage of protection, a business arrangement. It was insane. And yet, it was the only thing that made sense. "So we pretend?" she asked. "We play husband and wife to satisfy their morals?" A flicker of that profound pain crossed his face again. "I won't lie to you, Maggie. It's not just about protection. Since the fire, this house has been a tomb. I've just been waiting to die. Then you came. I saw Lily breathe again. I heard her voice. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than grief. You brought life back into these walls." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. Maybe we can build something real from all this brokenness." Before she could answer, before she could even process the desperate hope in his voice, there was a sharp knock at the door. Sam's body tensed. He moved to the door and opened it. Sheriff Turner stood on the porch, hat in hand, his face grim. 2 women from the church committee stood behind him, their expressions like stone. "Hawthorne," the sheriff said, "the town council had an emergency meeting. They ain't satisfied. They say words on a porch in the middle of the night don't make a marriage." One of the women stepped forward, her voice sharp. "We require proof, a license, vows before a preacher. Until then, that child is living in a house of sin, and we will not stand for it." Her eyes narrowed at Maggie. "We have already sent a letter to the circuit judge. We are petitioning to have the child removed and placed in a proper Christian home." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. They were going to take Lily. Sam's hand shot out, slamming against the doorframe. "Enough," he roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the house. You want a wedding? You'll have it. Soon. The sheriff nodded grimly. Best make it so, Sam. The judge arrives in 3 days. If you're not legally wed by the time he gets here, he'll have the papers to take that girl. And there won't be a damn thing I can do to stop him. He tipped his hat and they left, their victory hanging heavy in the air. Maggie stared at Sam, her body numb with terror. 3 days. They had 3 days to become a family, or she would lose her daughter forever. The choice had been made for them. That night, sleep was impossible. The next morning rose pale and gray. Maggie found Sam at the table, a steaming mug of coffee untouched in front of him. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. They've backed us into a corner, she said quietly. I know, he replied. He stood up and walked to the fireplace mantel. He reached behind the portrait of his wife and daughter and pulled out a small velvet box. He walked back to her, his face etched with a solemn gravity. This isn't how I ever imagined doing this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I know I'm not. I am a poor replacement for the man you lost, a man I feel responsible for. He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, worn smooth with age. This was my mother's, not my late wife's. I'm not trying to replace what I lost, Maggie. I'm trying to build something new. He sank to one knee on the rough-hewn floorboards of the house his father had built. His massive frame, which had seemed so intimidating just days before, now just looked impossibly sad and earnest. I am asking you not to save us from the town, not to protect Lily, but because I believe we can save each other. Maggie O'Connor, will you be my wife? Tears streamed down her face. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to not tie herself to this man and his ghosts and his guilt. But then a small voice came from the stairs. Mama. Lily stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, the little wooden doll clutched in her hand. She looked at Sam on his knee, then at her mother's tear-streaked face. A small, sleepy smile touched her lips. Mama, she whispered, say yes. Papa Sam makes you smile again. The child's innocent words shattered the last of her defenses. She knelt down in front of Sam, her small hands covering his. Yes, she sobbed. Yes, I will. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. For a moment, a fragile, impossible hope bloomed in the room. They weren't just two broken people. They were a family, forged in desperation, but a family nonetheless. They would get the license. They would find the preacher. They would be married before the judge arrived. They would win. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a lone rider appeared on the valley road. He rode a fine horse, and he sat tall in the saddle, a man with a purpose. He wasn't from the town. Maggie watched him from the window, the silver ring on her finger suddenly feeling cold as ice. The rider drew closer, and her blood ran cold. She knew that face, the sharp jawline, the cold, dark eyes. It was a face she hadn't seen since her husband's funeral, a face she had prayed she would never see again. Sam stepped onto the porch as the man dismounted. Can I help you? He asked, his voice wary. The man ignored him. His eyes were fixed on Maggie, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. Hello, Margaret, he said. You didn't think I'd let you disappear, did you? Maggie stepped out onto the porch, her knees shaking. Patrick, she whispered. It was her husband's brother. Who is this? Sam asked, stepping in front of her. Patrick's smile widened. He waved the papers in the air. I'm Patrick O'Connor, Lily's uncle, her legal next of kin. His eyes glinted with malice. And I've come to take my niece home. The law's on my side. You can play house all you want, but that little girl belongs to me. The hope that had bloomed just moments before withered and died. The town was no longer the threat. The judge was no longer the threat. The real monster had just arrived, and he was holding the one weapon they couldn't fight. Blood. Patrick O'Connor stood on their porch like a vulture, his legal papers a death sentence for the fragile family they were trying to build. You have no right, Maggie stammered, pulling Lily behind her skirts. I have every right, Patrick sneered, his eyes flicking over Sam with disdain. Blood is thicker than charity, Margaret. The law recognizes me as her guardian. You, a destitute widow, shacking up with a stranger? The judge will laugh you out of court. He had a point. Their planned marriage was a sham, a desperate defense. Against Patrick's legal claim, it was nothing. Sam stepped forward, his shadow falling over the smaller man. This woman and child are under my protection, he growled, his voice a low threat. You will leave. Patrick didn't even flinch. Brave words, Hawthorne, but they're just words. I have ink and a judge's seal. I'll be filing this petition in town. The hearing will be set for the end of the week. I'll see you there. He tipped his hat with mock politeness. And then I'll be back for my niece. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Maggie collapsed onto the porch steps, her body trembling with a terror colder than any winter wind. He'll do it, she whispered. He'll take her. Patrick had never cared for Lily, had never once offered them a crust of bread or a kind word. But he was greedy, and he was cruel. He saw Lily not as a child to be loved, but as an asset to be controlled. Sam knelt beside her, his large hand resting on her shoulder. No, he won't. His voice was calm, but his eyes were blazing. He thinks he has the law. We have the truth. He looked down at the silver ring on her finger. We have to get married, Maggie. Not in 3 days, tomorrow. We need to be a legal family when we face that judge. It's our only chance. It was a whirlwind. Sam rode into town and returned with the preacher and the license. The next day, they stood on the porch of the Hawthorne Ranch, the place that had become their sanctuary and their battlefield. Sheriff Turner stood as a witness, his face grim but resolute. A few of the more decent townsfolk had come, their curiosity now tinged with a grudging respect. Even Mrs. Whitmore was there, standing at the back, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Maggie's hands were cold as ice as she repeated the vows. The words felt hollow, a script for a play she never wanted to be in. But then she looked at Sam. He wasn't just speaking words. When he said, "Till death do us part," his voice was thick with the memory of a promise he had failed to keep once before. He was making a vow not just to her, but to the ghosts that haunted him. He was vowing to do it right this time. And when he slid the ring onto her finger, he looked her in the eye and said, "With this vow, I take you as my wife, not for appearances, not for pity, for life." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke her own vows, and for the first time, they felt real. "And I take you for the kindness you showed when the world was cruel, and for the love I believe can grow between us." Lily, standing between them, clapped her small hands. "Mom and Papa Sam," she chirped. A few people in the small crowd smiled. A legal marriage. They had done it. They had a shield. But would it be strong enough? The day of the hearing arrived. The town's small courthouse was packed. Patrick stood with his lawyer, smug and confident. Maggie sat with Sam, her hand clutching his so tightly her knuckles were white. The judge, a stern, white-haired man named Blackwood, entered the room and a hush fell. Patrick's lawyer presented the case simply. Patrick O'Connor was the child's sole living blood relative, aside from her mother. The mother was a penniless transient who, until a week ago, had been living in sin with a man of questionable reputation. Patrick, he argued, could offer stability. Then it was their turn. Sam spoke first, his voice deep and steady. He told the judge how he had found Maggie and Lily, how the child had been at death's door. He presented their marriage certificate. "I am her legal stepfather, Your Honor. This is her home. She is loved. She is safe." The judge looked from Sam to Patrick. "Mr. O'Connor," he said, "this man claims he saved your niece's life. Where were you when she was starving?" Patrick's smugness faltered for a second. "I was, unaware of the severity of the situation." "Unaware?" Maggie shot to her feet. "I sent you 2 letters. I begged you for help. You never even answered." Patrick's face turned purple. His lawyer tried to silence him, but it was too late. He pointed a trembling finger at Sam. "You want to know why he's so eager to help her? You want to know who this great savior is?" He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, you should ask Mr. Hawthorne to tell you the name of the mine where my brother died." The room fell silent. Maggie stared at Patrick, confused. What did that have to do with anything? Patrick's voice rose to a triumphant shout. It was the Blackwood Mine, the same mining company he owned. He's not helping her out of charity. He's doing it because he killed her husband. His negligence, his greed, put my brother in an early grave. He's trying to buy his conscience clean with my niece. A massive gasp went through the courtroom. Every eye turned to Sam. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to her new husband, her heart seizing in her chest. His face was pale. He couldn't meet her eyes. It was true. All of it. He hadn't just been a silent partner. He had been responsible. The judge stared down at Sam, his face like thunder. Mr. Hawthorne, is this accusation true? Sam rose to his feet slowly. He looked at Maggie, his eyes filled with a world of shame and regret. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's true? The room erupted in chaos. Maggie felt the floor drop out from under her. She had married the man who killed her husband. She had given him her trust, her life, her daughter. And it was all built on a foundation of blood and lies. Patrick was smiling, a look of pure victory on his face. He had won. He had destroyed them. The judge slammed his gavel, the sound cracking like a gunshot. Silence! Order in the court! The room slowly quieted. The judge's cold eyes were fixed on Sam. Mr. Hawthorne, you have put this court in a difficult position. You have lied by omission, and you have married this woman under false pretenses. Your character is now severely in question. Sam didn't flinch. He just stood there accepting the judgment. I never lied to her, Your Honor. I told her the truth the first night she was in my home. She knew who I was when she agreed to marry me. Maggie's head snapped up. It was true. In her rage and fear, she had forgotten. He had confessed. He hadn't hidden it. She was the one who had pushed it aside, blinded by desperation. The judge turned to her. Mrs. Hawthorne, is this true? Did you know of your husband's connection to the mine when you married him? The entire courtroom held its breath. This was the moment. She could destroy him. She could tell the judge she had been deceived, manipulated. She could nullify the marriage and walk away. But where would she walk? Into Patrick's clutches? Back to the street with her 7 cents? She looked at Patrick, his face alight with greedy triumph. He didn't care about Lily. He cared about winning. Then she looked at Sam. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her. There was no defense in his eyes, no plea. Only a quiet, devastating acceptance of whatever fate she chose for him. He had done a terrible thing, yes. His company had been responsible for her husband's death. But he was also the man who had wept for her dying child. He was the man who had faced down a mob for her. He was the man who was trying, day by day, to atone for his past. Her choice was not between two men. It was between vengeance and forgiveness. Between the past that was dead and a future that might, just might, be alive. She took a deep breath, her voice clear and strong in the silent room. Yes, Your Honor, I knew. My husband told me everything. Patrick's jaw dropped. The smug look on his face evaporated, replaced by disbelief. And you still married him? The judge asked, his eyebrows raised. I did, Maggie said, turning to face the judge, to face the whole town. I married him because my husband is a good man who made a terrible mistake, and he has spent every day since trying to make it right. I married him because he loves my daughter as his own. Patrick O'Connor, the man who wants to claim her, let her starve. He has never shown her an ounce of love. He sees her as property. Samuel Hawthorne sees her as a treasure. She looked at Lily, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. The law may talk about blood, Your Honor, but a family is built from love. And we, she said, taking Sam's hand, are a family. A murmur went through the crowd. Sheriff Turner stood up at the back of the room. Your Honor, if I may, I was there in the store. That child was minutes from death, and I saw the look on Hawthorne's face. It wasn't guilt. It was grief. He saved her life. That's a fact. Then another voice spoke up, thin but clear. Mrs. Whitmore. She stood, her hands clasped in front of her. He's right, she said, her voice surprisingly soft. I was wrong. I was cruel. I saw what he did. A home with that man is a better place for that child than any law can provide. The judge looked around the room, at the sheriff, at the town store owner, at the woman standing proudly by the man who was, by all accounts, responsible for her first husband's death. He looked at Patrick, whose face was now a mask of pure, impotent rage. Finally, he looked down at Lily. "Child," he said, his voice gentle, "who do you want to live with?" Lily didn't hesitate. She ran from her chair and wrapped her arms around Sam's leg, hiding her face against his trousers. Her voice was muffled, but everyone in the room heard her. "I want to stay with my Papa Sam." That was it. The judge's face softened. He looked at Patrick, and his expression turned to stone. "Mr. O'Connor, a blood claim does not give you the right to destroy a life. This court finds that it is in the best interest of the child, Lily O'Connor, to remain in the custody of her mother and her stepfather, Samuel Hawthorne. Petition denied." He slammed the gavel. "This case is dismissed." Relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Maggie. Sam swept Lily up into his arms, burying his face in her hair. The crowd began to buzz, some people clapping softly. Patrick stood frozen for a second, then stormed out of the courthouse, defeated. Justice had been served. Not the cold, hard justice of the law, but the warmer, messier justice of the heart. 3 months later, the Montana spring had chased the last of the snow from the high valley. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows. Maggie stood on the porch, a hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, where a new life was beginning to stir. In the pasture below, Sam was leading Lily on a small pony. The sound of her squeals and his deep, rumbling laughter drifted up on the warm breeze. The ghosts were still there, in the empty swing and the peeling paint of the rocking horse. They would always be there, but they were quieter now. They had made room for new life, new laughter. Sam lifted Lily down from the pony and she ran up the hill to Maggie, throwing her arms around her mother's waist. "Mama, Papa Sam says soon I'll have a baby brother to ride with." Maggie laughed, kissing the top of her head. Sam came and stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her, and the new life she carried. He leaned his cheek against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he whispered. "Happy." Maggie leaned back against his solid strength. "Neither did I." They stood there together, a man, a woman, and a child, looking out at the vast, beautiful, unforgiving land. They were a patchwork family, stitched together with grief and guilt and a desperate, stubborn hope. It wasn't a perfect story. It was scarred and messy, but it was theirs, and it was just beginning. What do you think? Do you believe a person can truly atone for their past, or are some mistakes too great to forgive? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of impossible choices and unexpected redemption.